Hello and welcome back. I'm Vega, and today we are going to be making Genshin Impact's Staff of Sands. This is one of the weapons used by one of my personal favorite characters, Cyno, and I built this one because I've been really working hard on finishing my Cyno Cosplay build, but obviously we need a weapon. Like, it's not complete without a fancy prop to carry around. So let's just go get crafting.
One of the main goals for this project was to make the staff travel ready and easily fit into my suitcase. To do so, I first measured out the height, deciding on 60 inches for the staff base. The PVC pipe used for the pole was then cut in half with a heat knife and the edges sanded smooth to prevent any seam gaps. To then reattach the two pieces, I used a long metal threaded rod called a plumbing nipple. Yes, that is what it's called, I checked. By warming up the PVC pipe, I was able to carve out a path for the threads on the metal rod, repeatedly twisting it in and out as the piping cooled. This part took a lot of finessing, and I had to rewarm the pipe several times until I could smoothly twist the plumbing nipple in and out. The longer 6-inch piece you see on screen now was the attachment point between the blade and the pole, while a smaller 2-inch one was used as the connector between the two pole halves. For this section, I had one side jammed securely into the pipe that could not twist out, while the other side I repeated the twisting to create a threaded path. You can see here that once complete, one piece of the pole should easily twist off while the other side remains stuck in place. With that finished, it was time to move on to making the blade portion. The pattern was drafted out on interfacing fabric and then transferred onto two pieces of 10mm EVA craft foam. To reinforce the blade, I had two plans. The first was to add some 3mm gauge garden wire. This was put along both sides so it wouldn't interfere with the center pattern, which will be carved out later. The wire was sandwiched between the two pieces with Dremeled grooves to help it lie flat. This on its own didn't provide a whole lot of extra stability, so I would recommend using thicker wire, though adding the resin later on did help with the stiffness. Once the contact cement was dry and the pieces firmly glued together, the edges were smoothed down and the metal fastening was glued to the end where I ensured there would be extra wire length to hold it in place. To ensure it was extra secure, I used a combo of hot glue and wood glue, also adding the wood glue inside the piece to stop the wire from shifting around. Once that was fully dried, it was time to move on to the detail work. This is where things got experimental, as I don't have a lot of experience with resin. First, I had to carve out the areas I wanted to be resin. To get a clean edge, I used my X-Acto knife and a heat gun to shrink the sides. You can see here that the cut lines become much more prominent with the heat. This made it significantly easier to then go in with the Dremel and remove the foam without making a mess of the edges. A few final additions before prepping the area, just adding some foam blocks and strips to the top and filling in any gaps. For the gaps, I used the cheaper option of gesso paint, but there's numerous options and techniques available. The surface was then primed by heat sealing the foam and adding a layer of filler and sander primer, which really saved me a lot of work later on. In the areas to be filled with resin, I first added a layer of Modern Masters metallic gold paint to ensure that the transparent resin would have gold undertones. Ah, yes, cue panic, because this is the part where I realized I was reaching the point of no return. First, I had to ensure that no resin would leak out the sides, so the ends were taped off with painter's tape. Honestly, it worked a lot better than I was expecting, though resin definitely still leaked through. And spoiler, I made a mess. But that's for later, time to mix that resin. I was very careful to give it a thorough mixing as there were no redos if it wasn't properly cured. For the color, I started with a light orange tinted with gold near the base, adding more orange near the edges for a nice gradient to represent the glowing seen on the weapon in-game. This was a pretty messy process because I did not have the right equipment, but luckily pretty easy to wipe up any mistakes. And before we continue on, Crafting Vega wanted to take over and explain a bit, so you go, girl.
Okay, let me explain the absolute madness going on here right now, because this is entirely experimental. Whew. So, because my original plan was to like cut out the pieces that I wanted in resin and then make a mold of those pieces and then cast them in resin, but I've never done that before, so I didn't really want to do it on such a like large scale, and B, I don't have time. I have like 3 days left to complete this. So my alternate solution was to carve out the little grooves in the spear and then fill that with resin. It looks really pretty right now. I'm also pretty sure it made a mess on the other side and like dripped down and through, so we're gonna have a lot of cleanup to do. But yeah, fingers crossed, this works.
Thank you for that, Vega. You're right, it was an absolute mess, but it worked. While waiting for the resin to cure, it was time to add all the little bits to the staff. For this, I used a nice thick 40mm high density foam block, carving out the pieces with a heat knife next to a vent because those fumes were something else. Because the pieces were so thick, it allowed me to just drill out a hole then slide them onto the pipe. 3D printed pieces would also have been a great alternative for this, but to be honest, I just don't like 3D printing as a personal preference. For the little runes on the end, I again traced it out with the X-Acto knife, then passed over it with a heat gun to make those nice, clean, and defined lines. The pole was then primed with 3 layers of Plasti-Dip and painted with a black and gold spray paint combo and airbrushed with a gradient. Painting complete, time to go check on the resin. It turned out so well. Oh my goodness. Just look at that color and the gradient to darker orange. I'm in love with how this turned out. And here's the mess that I mentioned. So the resin definitely did leak through, and then because I was silly and originally didn't have a protective sheet of plastic, it fused with the cardboard on the other side. Luckily, it was pretty easy to sand off, and this is where the sander and primer layer kind of saved me because the foam was still protected. Before pouring resin on the next side, I made sure to add that layer of plastic wrap to prevent all of that from happening again. Fast forward through all of that being finished, I then needed to fill the side grooves with resin. The hope was to sand out the sides, and the resin poured would then be blocked by the resin already there on either side. Honestly, it worked out pretty well. After all the resin was cured, I went in with the Dremel again to remove the foam edges that were left to keep the resin from spilling out. These edges were then covered in a very thin layer of resin to complete the look. Finally, on to painting. The tape masking was a pain in the ass, but there was no way I wanted to ruin that beautiful and painful work. I did the blade in a black base with brown toning and a gradient near the top. All of the foam details were painted separately and glued onto the bottom, including some little resin pieces left over for some extra flair. The gem at the top was the only part that I decided to have completely resin all the way through, made of 2 resin half circles. I definitely wish I had the time to make all of the resin like that because it looked so cool in the light, but that will be for next time. And there it is, Cyno's main weapon, the Staff of Sands, ready for travel and ready to bop some helitrails. You can see here how perfectly it fits into my suitcase, and this made me ridiculously happy. I got to debut his full look at my first ever Katsucon this year and was so excited talking to people about weapon builds. To all of those of you who were asking me questions on how I made it, hopefully I was able to give you a decent answer, but if not, now you have a whole tutorial. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see and support more builds like this, please consider checking out my Patreon. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you can see the rest of Cyno's cosplay build.